3, 2, 1.
Okay, hi. This is Tony Davis, Andrew Clark, Rodney Landrum, here with Glenn Berry at SQL Class 2011. So Glenn, do you want to just start by telling us just briefly who you are, what you do?
Well, sure. My name's Glenn Berry. I'm a SQL Server MVP. I'm a database architect for Avalara in Bainbridge Island. So that's kind of what I do.
So what does that entail?
Well, you know, a database architect is just sort of a fancy name for a senior DBA, but we kind of what you end up doing is designing systems and deciding what kind of infrastructure you're going to run on, where your databases run, how they're structured, and sort of what an architect does.
Okay. And how long have you been DBA?
Well, I used to be a developer before I grew up and became a DBA, so I'd say I've been a DBA about 10, 12 years now. Before that I was a developer. That's pretty common. A lot of DBAs start off as developers.
Okay. And what was your route in from development to DBA?
Well, I just kept finding myself working more on data access stuff and being interested in making database servers run faster and queries run faster, so I just was sort of drawn to being a DBA. Plus, I was kind of more detail-oriented. I'd rather make it perfect, and that's not so good for developers. Usually they're trying to do stuff fast and dirty, so that's kind of how it happened, I think.
And how did you get especially interested in the hardware side of things? I mean, as a DBA, many DBAs have a fairly, maybe a surface level understanding.
Well, there's probably two sources for that. Number one, I used to always like to build PCs out of parts just for the fun of it and overclock them and picked all the components. And then I kept running into problems where the system admin people at different jobs I worked at didn't seem to know that much about hardware. And as a DBA, if the server's running slow, you kind of get the blame. You know, and you're closer to the server than, say, a developer. So I just got more interested in it and found all these opportunities to make things better. So that's how it started.
Well, that kind of leads into one of my questions, and it's all written down here, but it's just what you said. So the problem, one of the problems I see is that database performance really is tied to the disk subsystem ultimately. So be it SAN or local disk. So since the DBA is not typically part of the picture when it comes to developing or designing SAN space, we have to work with the server administrators, and they give us what they want to give us. So outside of a DBA having to be a SAN administrator, what can DBA do to kind of take and empower that role to force the company to see the performance gain?
Well, you know, what you say is very common, that there's this sort of wall between the SAN administrators and the DBAs, and sometimes there's not a very good communication going on there. And I think as a DBA, you have to kind of fight that and become involved, if possible, in the design and in the tuning of the SAN. Don't just take what they give you. But if that's the case, you can just try to gather metrics with DMVs and PerfMon to show if you have I/O bottlenecks, there really is a problem. And then work with the SAN team to do something about it. Don't just, because what will happen so often, you've probably seen this, where you're running into I/O bottlenecks and you see it on SQL, and they say, oh, the SAN is fine, right? And that's very frustrating. You got to keep on. You can't just give up and take that as an answer.
Yeah. Okay. If I may.
You may, Rodney.
Follow up
just about to jump in there, but you go. Yeah.
So taking that to the next level, so we have different architectures for development and for production systems. So if I'm a developer and I'm writing a store procedure and I have a 4-proc system virtual machine in my development environment, and this is going to be taken to a production system with 64 gig, multi-core system, 64 procs, I mean 64 gigs of RAM, and you're going to see a different, maybe optimization, different plan for that particular query. What are some of the kind of things you can do, since you have been a developer to a DBA, to help the development team understand architecturally how to make the query run faster, and from a DBA perspective, how to, I guess, work with the developers and the infrastructure team to know what's really going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, ideally you have identical systems between some sort of integration environment and production. Of course, not everybody has the budget to do that.
Right.
So what you can try to do, if possible, is have a subset of it. So maybe you've got 64 gigs of RAM and 16 logical processors in production. Maybe you only have 32 gigs or 16 gigs in development, and you have less processors. But you don't want to be just doing a desktop one processor, because then you're going to have problems, with different query plans and trying to figure out what's going on there.
Well, I can say in my company in particular, all of our development QA environments are virtual,
Okay.
and all production is physical. And there's a big disparity between development and production environments. And we often find that when a query is promoted to production, we have a lot of weight stats that are CX packet related, parallel query plans related. And what we typically do is just try and tune the best we can based on the information we have. But is there really, what is the best way, I guess, to kind of bring those two worlds together, development and DBA, with the architecture being the kind of centerpiece around all that?
Well, if you're stuck with the virtual environment development and physical environment production, it's going to be harder, but I think that's where you have to have the development team and the production DBA working together. Because sometimes you can't really tell what's going to happen with the workload until it's in production. You end up sort of having to tune in production a little bit and see how it acts out there, and then use those, what you find there to come up with new indexes or new ways to optimize the query that don't show up when it's in development on a virtual environment and no other load but your testing load. So,
do you often find that a development database might have half as many records as a production system?
Oh yeah, that's a big problem, and I know there's tools out there that'll generate data so you get more production-like load. But that's only part of the problem, because you also have to worry about the other load that might be on the system in production. And that's pretty hard to do in the development to get a realistic load. Sometimes problems don't show up unless you're under some load. It runs fine against a big table under no load, and once you have more concurrency in production, problems start to show up.
Right, yeah, it's a big issue, concurrency. So what we typically do, and it's not across the board because it's an expensive proposition, is to have a staging. So dev, testing, possibly QA within a staging area that mimics physically what the production will be.
Yeah, that's ideal if you can do that. That's a good plan.
Yeah, but it is expensive, so not everyone does it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Do you see, are the days of these SAN systems in any way numbered? Do you see things getting simpler?
Well, the SAN vendors would like to hear that, but if you look at what Microsoft and the big vendors like HP and Dell are recommending for a lot of their fast track systems, a lot of those are direct attached storage.
Yeah.
So they're so much less expensive. They have less flexibility, but you can get more performance for less money with direct attached storage, especially when it comes to sequential I/O performance. You can blow a SAN out of the water with good direct attached storage.
Yeah.
And following that vein, do you see that ultimately a sequential read, a table scan, essentially, is going to be faster than indexing? And that's the whole parallel data warehouse.
Yeah, it could get to that point, and some of the stuff that's coming out of Microsoft, that they're putting more emphasis on trying to have more stuff in memory. This stuff that's Project Apollo, the new index type there. A lot of that depends on it being in memory. If you don't have enough to fit that index into memory, you're going to go from batch processing to row processing mode, and you lose a lot of performance that shows up there. So having more memory is a big deal. So sequential reads are going to be part of that to get it off the disk of memory as fast as possible.
So interestingly, if you were to have a database, and many organizations do, like my own, a database that's a terabyte in size, but you're limited to 64 gigs of RAM per cost or whatever reason, and you're using pretty much every data element in that database. Do you see in the future that memory is going to be a component that will reach into the terabyte range?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's already getting there. The cost per gigabyte is down to about $25 per gigabyte right now. So you can get a 16 gigabyte DIMM for about $450, and that price just keeps going down. So, they're already going to raise the memory limit in Windows 8 to be above 2 terabytes. And you would look at, of more than 2 terabytes in your commodity server affordably in the next probably 18 months. Yeah. So that's going to solve a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So is that essentially why Adam Mechanic in his pre-con said that for 10 years DBAs are obsessing about I/O, and over the next 5 years he says that's going to change completely.
Yeah. And plus I/O is starting to get faster with SSDs and Fusion I/O cards, that kind of thing too. So.
I didn't think about that, but brings up another good point. We actually looked at Fusion I/O and some other SSD technology. The limitation therein is that these are cards you put into a system, so you lose benefit of clustering, for example, and recommendations to use TempDB for your kind of first foray into SSD technology. At least that's what we've been recommending here. Have you had a lot of experience with SSD, and what kind of experience
Yeah,
have you had?
we've been using Fusion IO at Avalara and having pretty good results. It really depends on where you're seeing your bottlenecks and what kind of a workload you have. But probably the recommendation you were getting was if you're seeing a lot of random IO against 10 dB, Fusion IO is good for that. And what I did find is, it was kind of surprised me, is a Fusion IO card, at least the one model we had, which is a 640 gig IO drive Duo, it has 2 devices, and each one of the devices was limited to about 1.5 gigabytes per second for sequential I/O. And I could get more sequential I/O out of a big RAID 10 array of SAS drives than I could out of the Fusion I/O. So Fusion I/O is not the solution for everything, at least in that particular model. The bigger, more expensive models and the new ones that just came out have more capacity. But don't just think that, oh yeah, I'll put everything on Fusion I/O and all my problems will go away.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely expensive technology, but if you have a use for it, we can make it. We recommend it. But again, in our case, it was one of those situations where we thought we had a big I/O load. That was our bottleneck. It turns out it wasn't. And it goes back to the point of really knowing where your bottlenecks are.
Yeah.
So just if you could speak to that as far as the DBA to architecture, what are some of the ways, just simplistically or high level, that DBA can quickly ascertain whether your hardware bottlenecks?
Well, I mean, my sort of infamous DMV queries that are out there on the internet, you can run those, and one of the ones in there is a cumulative weight stats query. So it'll tell you what your top cumulative weight stat is since SQL's been restarted. So that gives you a pretty good indication of what your current top bottleneck is. Based on what that is, you can start drilling into, okay, it looks like it might be an I/O problem. Let's run all these other queries to see if it really is an I/O problem. And then related to that is maybe you find one bottleneck and alleviate it, just moves somewhere else, So that's always kind of frustrating when chasing the bottleneck around.
Sure.
I've got one or two questions
Okay.
on to reading the book. One is it's a very interesting chapter that you wrote in which you say that okay, you've got a 4-year-old server. All the sort of Microsoft products say 2003 on here, so those are getting a bit sort of, and you don't offer any hope to people who are stuck with systems like that. You're saying just get rid of them,
Yeah.
buy new everything, and install it. Is there nothing that you can do with a 4-year-old SQL Server system?
Well, I mean, my argument there is that the hardware has gotten so much better in the past 3 or 4 years. And if you're running on Windows Server 2003, it's out of mainstream support from Microsoft. If you're running on SQL Server 2005, it's out of mainstream support from Microsoft. And your hardware, if it's more than 3 years old, it's probably out of warranty.
Into life
So,
and death, yes, for sure.
They'll have a 3-year warranty and they'll let you extend it, but they charge so much for it, you're better off to buy new hardware. It's cheaper to do that, and it's going to be so much better. And I always say, if you're going to buy new hardware, you might as well put a new, fresh copy of the latest OS on there, and maybe if you're stuck on that old version of SQL Server, but hopefully you also upgrade that, so you do it all at once, and you're so much better off instead of dealing with this stuff that has less horsepower than my laptop. And I'm serious. A 4-socket server from 4 years ago has less CPU horsepower than my little 3-pound laptop. That's the difference.
So have we sort of got to get used to the idea that the server, the effective life of the server is about 3 years?
Well, if performance is an issue, I would say, yeah. Sometimes if you just literally don't have the budget and you're doing okay on that old 4-year-old server, then it can keep on soldiering on. But if you're worried about performance, you really need to think about upgrading probably every 2 to 3 years.
So should I segue into Azure at this point and how that's going to be impactful?
Feel free.
Okay, got it.
Segue away.
Well, I mean, that's the sales pitch, right? I mean, what can Azure do for hardware, and how is that going to impact DBAs who might otherwise have invested their career into localized systems?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not anti-Azure, and I'm not like some DBAs seem to be that I'm worried I'm going to lose my job because of Azure. But certain things, that aren't tier 1 mission critical apps, they make sense to move into Azure. I mean, you don't have to worry about hardware and patching your servers and you still have to worry about designing your databases and writing your queries and optimizing your queries. So there's still some DBA work to do. And so I can see some non-mission critical things moving up into Azure, and that's not a big deal. But it's going to be a while, just because Microsoft's pushing it so hard doesn't mean that people are all going to jump on board with everything immediately. And there's still problems, especially in Europe. You guys should be familiar with this, where they've got all these laws where you can't have data in another country from your country. So that's going to be an issue that slows down adoption, I think.
Same with us, where we have HIPAA constraints and all the other US-based mandates and regulations.
Yeah. So I think there'll be plenty of hardware to maintain for DBAs, for a while.
I can say from just a personal perspective, I have never been allowed in my server room. I don't have my key swipe does not get me into the server room. I've followed a server admin there one time. It was cold in there, and I saw a lot of nice servers, and I could recognize, oh, that's probably my specific server. But other than that, they don't go in there too often.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. A lot of DBAs aren't even allowed to RDP into the desktop on their server. All they can do is go through Management Studio. I think that's a mistake. I've been lucky enough that I can, I'm an admin on my servers, and it's up to me to maintain them. Because I want to know what's happening with them instead of relying on the sysadmin.
I mean, one final question then. You mentioned you're well, geez, give me the wrap-ups. We can edit that bit out. I'm talking wrap-up.
Is your battery getting flat here?
She died 5 minutes ago. That's it.
She's holding it up.
I was just going to follow up. You are quite a proponent of the latest and greatest hardware operating system and SQL Server. So when do you think are you hoping you'll be going to SQL Server 2012? Pretty soon after it.
Well, I've been lucky enough in my new job that we're re-architecting everything from the ground up. So we just went out and bought almost $500,000 worth of hardware, and we're debating whether we're going to throw Denali on there or stay with the 2008 R2. But if we go with Denali, it could be quite soon. Even while it's still in CTP, Microsoft wants us to do some stuff with a tab, for always-on availability. So we might go that direction. It's still up in the air.
So that's a big motivator. Is that the main motivating force, the always on?
Well, that and also the column store index. We have a use case where that might come in really handy for us. So we get that with Denali for 2012, we should probably.
No more Denali.
Yeah.
We were told. And I think you have one more question.
Well, maybe this one's off the record, I don't know, but I'm intrigued because I haven't gone anywhere near hardware for years, but there was a time when on the front of the machine there was a big red button that said Turbo.
Right.
And what intrigues me is that there is still a sort of turbo mode, except it can't mean the same thing. And also there's something called hyperthreading that sounds like turbo to me. I just don't understand hyperthreading.
Okay.
What is hyperthreading and how can you get magical sort of extra processes that don't exist?
Okay, well, yeah, that's kind of two separate questions, but hyperthreading was something Intel came up with back in 2002 because they noticed that quite often the processor was waiting on main memory. So the classic example is you do an antivirus scan and then suddenly your desktop is sort of frozen while it's running. So they came up with a way to divide a processor into two logical processors that look like two processors to the operating system, even though you only really have one physical processor. And that worked really well for things like letting you play solitaire while the virus scan was going, but it didn't work as well for SQL Server workloads. And now they've made some improvements to the later processors, so it works better for SQL Server workloads, especially OLTP workloads, but you really should test it with your workload. And when it works better, you can get maybe 20 to 30% more performance. It's not twice as good as you might expect. So that's hyperthreading. And then Turbo, they have something called Turbo Boost for Intel that overclocks or speeds up individual cores in a processor based on the heat load and the electrical usage of the processor. And that's nothing but good. That just makes the processor run faster, and there's no danger of overheating. So that's a very common thing. It's even in laptops.
In your book, you don't come over as a sort of green, sort of tree-hugging, sort DBA, in that you were saying don't do sort of green mode.
Well, yeah, but that's
Go
ironic.
to performance.
Because I actually am a green person. I've got solar panels on my house in Colorado, and that's why I think I said it, that I kind of felt bad about recommending that people change the power plan from balance to high performance.
Yes.
But I'm saying this is for database servers, and it's not for the thousands of web servers that you might have. It's for your mission critical database servers. It makes sense to do that.
But you get more value per watt from a server that's got all the turbo boosts and
Right, exactly. You get all the performance that you're supposed to get out of it.
yeah.
So I think Annabelle's about out of battery there.
I'm not. I'm recording it all. Okay, we'll have interview height.
The camera's pointing the wrong way.
Okay. Yep. Right. All right.